night fell over the city of Brooksville, plunging it in deep darkness. Emily, a young woman of 25, sat in her apartment, looking out the window as the full moon cast a pale light on the deserted street below. It was a peaceful night, and the feeling of loneliness enveloped her like a cloak. Emily always liked the peace that the night offered. The silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the whisper of the wind, drew her out of the house. The calm of the night was a refuge from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. That evening, Emily decided to take a walk through the city park, a serene, wooded area that she had frequented since childhood. It was a place where she felt at home, especially at night when few people ventured there. She threw on a coat to protect herself from the autumn chill and grabbed her keys and a cell phone. Only for emergencies, she thought. With one last look at the dark apartment, Emily headed downstairs to the quiet street. The park was deserted when she arrived, with empty benches under the dim streetlights. Emily began to walk slowly along the gravel paths, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. The breeze gently swayed the trees, creating a gentle symphony of rustling leaves. As Emily walked deeper into the park, a strange sensation enveloped her. She felt as if she were being watched, as if invisible eyes were following her closely. Her heart started to beat faster, and she looked around but didn't see anyone. "It's just her imagination, Emily," she whispered to herself. "There's nothing here but trees and bushes." However, the feeling persisted. Emily could have sworn she heard soft footsteps in the dirt and the whisper of someone approaching. Every time she looked over her shoulder, she saw no one there. She forced herself to keep walking, but fear began to creep into her heart. As Emily continued her walk, the feeling that someone was following her became stronger. She began to walk faster, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. Every time she looked back, she had the feeling that a dark shadow was moving quickly, disappearing between the trees. Finally, as Emily rounded a bend in the path, she caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure disappearing behind a tree. Her heart raced in panic, and she tried to remain calm as she continued to walk. The footsteps seemed to follow her, maintaining the same distance, always at the edge of her field of vision. Emily broke out in a cold sweat, her mind spinning for an explanation for what was happening. She couldn't see the face of the person following her, just a dark, indistinct figure. Fear rose within her, a sense of vulnerability that paralyzed her. Emily was now in a more isolated part of the park, where the streetlights were weaker. She knew she needed to do something, but what? Continuing to walk, Emily took her cell phone from her pocket and quickly dialed the number of her best friend, Sophie. She wanted to share her concern, but when she brought the phone to her ear, her hand was shaking so much that the phone fell to the floor. The sound of the phone hitting the gravel echoed through the deserted park. Emily stood frozen for a moment before bending down to pick it up. When she finally managed to grab it, she heard a distant sound, as if someone was approaching. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. It was time to find help or escape. With her heart beating wildly, Emily started walking faster towards the park's exit, praying that the mysterious stalker wouldn't catch up to her. The silent shadow continued to follow her, always remaining at a disturbing distance. Fear was growing inside Emily, and she knew that she would have to face this unknown threat, or her nighttime nightmare would never end. The park, once so peaceful and welcoming, now seemed like a death trap for Emily. With every step she took towards the exit, the shadow seemed to follow her. Emily clutched the cell phone in her hand, ready to dial the emergency number at any moment. Her mind was in turmoil, trying to understand who was following her and why. The shadow's stealthy footsteps echoed in her ears, like a macabre echo of her own presence. She tried to turn a corner to lose her pursuer, but the dark figure followed her without hesitation. Fear turned to panic when Emily realized she couldn't free herself from the shadow. It was as if her pursuer knew exactly where she was going, as if he had been one step ahead the entire time. Finally, Emily reached the main street, where the lighting was brighter and there were a few people walking. She felt momentarily safe among the crowd, but she couldn't help but look over her shoulder, looking for the shadow that had followed her. The shadow, however, did not approach. She remained at a distance, watching her from the shadows of a dark alley. Emily was grateful to be temporarily safe, but fear gripped her. With her heart still racing, she approached a group of people waiting at the bus stop. Emily quickly explained the situation, but the strangers looked at her with skepticism and concern. "You should call the police," suggested one of the strangers, pointing in the direction of a nearby phone booth. Determined to resolve this situation, Emily followed the advice and called the emergency number. She explained what had happened, but the police officer's voice on the other end sounded skeptical. "Do you have any proof that someone is following you?" he asked. Emily looked down the dark alley where the shadow had hidden. The dark figure was still there, watching her with invisible eyes. "I have no proof, but I'm sure someone is chasing me." The police officer agreed to send a squad car to the location, but Emily knew it would be difficult to prove the existence of the mysterious shadow. She thanked the officer and hung up the phone. The group of strangers at the bus stop seemed uncomfortable with the situation and began to disperse. Emily was left alone again, feeling vulnerable and at the mercy of her invisible stalker. She looked once more toward the dark alley, but the shadow was gone. Emily knew she needed to find a way to find out who was following her and why before it was too late. Emily knew she couldn't go home while the stalker was on the loose. The silent shadow would continue to pursue her, always lurking in the shadows. Fear was growing inside her, and she knew that she would have to face this unknown threat, or her nighttime nightmare would never end. After calling the police, Emily decided to remain on the busy street, waiting for the police to arrive. She knew she was safer there than at home, where the stalker could easily find her. The minutes dragged on, and the tension only increased. Finally, the lights of a police cruiser flashed in the distance, and Emily sighed in relief. The police disembarked, and she ran towards them, explaining the situation again, the fear still present in her words. The officers listened carefully and promised to check the dark alley where the shadow had last been seen. As two of them walked towards the alley, Emily remained next to the third officer, who asked some detailed questions about the events. Meanwhile, the police car's lights swept through the darkness, illuminating the alley. Emily saw the shadowy figure moving once more, but now she knew she wasn't crazy. The police approached cautiously, flashlights in hand. "Did you see anything there?" asked the police officer who was with Emily. She pointed in the direction of the alley, but when the police shone their flashlights, there was no one there. The shadow had disappeared again, as if it were made of smoke. "There's no one here," said one of the police officers. "Are you sure you're not confusing things, miss?" The doubt in the officer's voice made Emily feel frustrated and helpless. She knew she wasn't imagining things. Someone was following her, someone who could disappear into the shadows when necessary. The police searched the area, but did not find concrete evidence of the presence of a stalker. Emily was discouraged, but she wouldn't give up so easily. She asked them to escort her home, as she didn't feel safe returning alone. The officers agreed to accompany her, and Emily eventually returned to her apartment. However, the relief was brief. She knew the stalker was still out there, watching her. Fear consumed her, but also the determination to discover the identity and intentions of this invisible stalker. In the weeks that followed, Emily became a vigilante of her own life. She installed security cameras in her home and around her building, hoping to capture an image of the stalker. She shared her story with friends and family, asking them to stay alert. But the stalker continued to evade her efforts, remaining in the shadows, watching and waiting. Emily couldn't escape the feeling that she was in a constant nightmare, not knowing when or how it would end. The stalker's true identity remained a mystery, and the intentions behind this silent pursuit were unknown. Emily was determined to discover the truth, no matter how sinister it was. She knew her safety was at stake, and she could no longer live in fear of the unknown. Months have passed since Emily reported the chase to the park and authorities. Despite her efforts to protect herself, the mysterious stalker continued to haunt her, watching her from the shadows and leaving her with a constant feeling of paranoia. Emily had changed her daily routines, trying to make it difficult for her stalker. She frequently went out with friends, installed additional security devices in her home, and took extra precautions. However, the nights were always the worst, when the feeling that someone was watching her in her own home tormented her. One day, Emily decided to take a drastic measure. She hired a private investigator to discover the stalker's identity. The investigator dove into the case, reviewing all available clues and examining records of her frightening experiences. However, the stalker remained an elusive shadow. There were no tangible records, no concrete evidence, and the feeling that someone was always watching persisted. Frustrated, Emily decided to do something she had never imagined. She began writing about her experience on a personal blog, detailing each incident, each encounter with the invisible shadow. She hoped that by sharing her story, someone might offer some help or insight. To her surprise, the blog quickly gained attention. Other people shared similar stories, experiences of inexplicable persecution and observation. Together, these voices formed a community of victims of unknown stalkers. As the blog grew, a particularly observant reader began to notice patterns in Emily's and other victims' accounts. He was a skilled hacker and began tracking the stalker's digital presence, following the invisible traces left in victims' online activities. As the hacker progressed in his search, he discovered an intriguing pattern. All of the victims, including Emily, had received email messages and text messages from an unknown sender. These messages contained vague threats and disturbing remarks, but none of them revealed the identity of the stalker. The hacker, determined to expose the stalker, decided to trace the digital trail of these messages to their origin. He used his skills to follow a complex trail of IP addresses and encrypted servers, finally arriving at a point of origin. The address led the hacker to an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city of Emily. Cautiously, he approached the location, where he found a clandestine internet connection. The house was empty and covered in dust, as if no one had lived there for years. However, the hacker discovered disturbing evidence that someone had recently been there. There were photos and news clippings of the victims scattered throughout the house, along with obsessive notes about their lives. It was the stalker's lair, a place where he observed and planned his actions. The hacker shared his findings with the police, who immediately launched an investigation. Based on the evidence found in the abandoned house, they were able to track the stalker to his hideout. That night, authorities arrested the stalker, revealing his identity as a man who had developed an unhealthy obsession with Emily and other victims. He had used his technological skills to terrorize them, watching them from the shadows and sending disturbing messages. With the stalker behind bars, Emily has finally regained a sense of safety. She knew her life would never be the same again, but she had found strength in sharing her story and joining other victims. The stalking experience transformed her from a frightened victim to a determined survivor. She had faced the shadow that had haunted her, and although the scars of the experience never completely disappeared, she was determined to move on and find new meaning in her life.